Welcome everyone to another edition of the Essendon History Podcast, always striving with me, Gregor McCaskey, Manager of Heritage here at the Footy Club, and my co-pilot and friend, Dan Eddy.
Good to see you again, Gregor, and plenty to talk about with the Magpies.
Plenty to talk about with the Magpies and Anzac Day, special Anzac Day edition today, right, Dan, and it doesn't get any bigger or better than this, with the exception of the grand final, of course, but the beauty of Anzac Day is everyone's got a stake in the game, whether you follow the Swans or St Kilda or Geelong. Everyone's an Anzac Day specialist, I think, these days.
Yeah, everyone's still very jealous that they don't get to have a run on the MCG on that day. They have to, as you said, the neutral fan probably has to cheer for a draw, perhaps, which was a good thing to do back in '95. But it's more a celebration, isn't it, of the significance of the day in general, and just as a bonus that we get to be one of the teams to actually play on the day.
It sure is, and there isn't a bigger game, like we said, in the AFL calendar than this one. And there's been a general resurgence in the last 20 years or so, I think, in the Anzac Day legend, and this game really is a part of that, I think, part of people's understanding of the events of that time. This is the 24th time we're going to be playing Collingwood on Anzac Day, Dan, since we kicked off in that draw in 1995, like you mentioned. And the ledger is just tilting their way. Collingwood's 13 wins to 9, and of course that first game was a draw, and we'll get onto that in a minute, and we'll talk about that. Interestingly enough, the league scheduled midweek games on Anzac Day in 1960, not the first time, but from 1960, and it took an act of Parliament. A lot of people might not be aware of this, but it took an act of Parliament for games to get played on Anzac Day because they'd been banned for many, many years. In fact, the first time that we played on, now this is a trivia pursuit question for anyone out there, the first time that we played on the 25th of April was in 1914. But for anyone listening, 1914 was a year before the Anzac Day landings. But curiously, we played in 1914 against Geelong at the Corio Oval. And we've played Carlton on the 25th of April on 6 occasions, Fitzroy once, Geelong just that once in 1914, Hawthorn in 1970, Melbourne 3 times, North Melbourne once, Richmond twice, and St Kilda once. But as I say, it wasn't until an Act of Parliament in 1960 that allowed games to get played on Anzac Day, because it was a day that was reserved for, it was a sombre occasion and a day that was reserved for things other than football. Since then, we've had, well, it's been quite a run. There's been great crowds, some terrific games, as we'll talk about in a minute, and of course a cup that gets shared, perpetual cup trophy that goes from club to club, and in latter years a medal as well. Yeah,
and just on that, I mean, the stadium's always packed too, which is, and if you've been to many of those games, I reckon I've maybe been to half of them, or a bit over half. And the pin drop when you stand there for the last post and the national anthem, it's one of the most amazing experiences you can have, and I guess the anticipation leading into actually hoping your team goes well. But from those crowds, Gregor, I know the highest was on that first day in 1995, the famous day when we had 94,800.
And that many locked outside?
Yeah, and about that, yeah, that's right. A bit like the women's first game when everyone was waiting outside the big crush. And the lowest is 57,294 in 2004, which I haven't checked, but that might be a wet day, that one, because it's very rare. But I think the average is somewhere above 80,000 for, that is remarkable. Yes. And if you think about it, it's not very often that both teams are first and second on the ladder going into that game. One of us is usually a bit lower than the other. So the fact that we're still drawing that much, I guess that's more a testament as well to the Anzacs and the occasion. But pretty amazing that they can average over 80,000 25 years in a row, pretty much. It's remarkable.
It is remarkable, and we got Kevin Sheedy to thank for this, of course, because it was Kevin's bright idea to schedule this game between the two biggest clubs in the competition, and it was Kevin that went off and spoke to Collingwood, and of course they were interested, and then together spoke to the RSL, and Bruce Ruxton, the late Bruce Ruxton, was a Collingwood supporter, I understand. So I think anything that was going to put Collingwood front and centre was okay with Brucey boy, so that's what happened. And it's been the the most eagerly awaited fixture since then.
And it's probably, I'm guessing you might know better than me, but it's almost the first big marquee game, isn't it? There's almost one every round now for something. But in terms of an occasion game, it's almost one of the first that was introduced that has gone on and on. We think now, I mean, Good Friday was played last year for the first time. We've had the Dreamtime game for a few years now. We've now got the Country Farmers game as well. But it's almost, I reckon it'd be one of the first that's become the big event game.
I think you're right, Dan. There's been a few since then, of course. There's games honouring all sorts of causes and dates. But this one, I think, is kicked it off, for sure. And
there's rounds now, like multicultural round and things like that. So there's been a lot of channeling the marketing towards a specific thing. But I think Sheeds and Bruce Ruxton and the Magpies, I think they might have been one of the pioneers in that sense.
Definitely.
Our boys who play this grand old game are always striving for glory and fame.
Last time we were here talking, Dan, we were talking about the lead into the Essendon Adelaide game in round one. And of course, our history against Adelaide is relatively brief compared to that our history with Collingwood. For obvious reasons, Collingwood formed in 1892. We formed in 1897, played each other in the association, the VFA, and were inaugural members of the VFL. So we've played a lot of football between the two clubs. In fact, 235 games since 1897. Ledger tilts towards Collingwood again, just like Anzac Day. They've won 128 to us 103, and surprisingly, for 235 games, there's only been 4 draws in that time. It's remarkable, isn't it?
It is remarkable. Yeah, we'll talk about two of them especially shortly. But yeah, to think, that's quite an amazing stat. I was surprised. I was expecting you to say 20 or something. So yeah, amazing.
And there hasn't even been that many grand finals between the two clubs. We won in 1901, they won in 1902, we won in 1911, they won in 1990. But we might pick up on a couple of those games. You've written a fair bit, Dan, about the early period in the club's history. 1901, a premiership year for Essendon, and the great Albert Thurgood. What can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, he'd been a star for us in the 1890s when we won 4 premierships in a row. We played in the last 3 of those, and then due to finances and the goldfields booming over in Western Australia and not much work here in Victoria, he went to WA for a little while, and so he wasn't with us when we won our 1897 flag. But he had returned, I think, the year after that, and so in 1901... I think he was pretty desperate to get himself a premiership, and his performances in the finals for us were sensational. It's really created his legend in a VFL sense anyway, where he almost, you could say, single-handedly won us the semi-final. It was pretty remarkable what he did up forward for us that day. I think he might have almost passed the ball to himself at one point. It was such an amazing performance. So he got us into the grand final, and then in what was a low-scoring era, he kicked 3 goals in the grand final as well to help us beat the Pies by 27 points. So, again, he was the difference on the day. So it is known as Thurgood's match or Thurgood's final series, definitely. We talk about Michael Long in 93, but Thurgood was that sort of equivalent, I guess, back in. So he got us that premiership that year, so really cemented his legend, I guess, at Essendon.
Remarkable player indeed. The following year, we didn't quite get over the line against them, but we were back in 1911, and coaching us that year was Jack Worrell. Now, Jack Worrell had a lot of success at Carlton and won what they would say these days is a three-peat, Dan.
The
first ever repeat, there you go, 1906, 1907 and 1908. And then he came to Essendon in 1911 and...
Yeah, and thankfully he didn't lose his magic touch in the process. Remarkable, actually, a little connection of maybe no relevance, but the president of Carlton's premiership teams in those first couple of premierships ended up being the grandfather of Dick Reynolds' future wife. So he had a connection to Carlton going back to then, and that's when Worrell was coaching the Blues. If that all makes sense to our listeners, probably doesn't. Worrell, we were very lucky to get him because I found one reference where they called him the Napoleon of football. He was the trailblazer, the general. In a day when still a lot of the captains were doing the coaching roles and there weren't a lot of standalone coaches, he was one of the first. He wasn't the first, but he was one of the first to really have a significant impact on teams in his training methods and things like that. So we were very fortunate to get him when he was still at the peak of his powers, and he'd been a great cricketer. Not much gets talked about him, so you better read my book because it's very interesting. Because Worrell deserves to be a legend of the game for what he achieved, and then he wrote for many years for the Australasian as well. So huge impact, and he led us to that premiership after a 10-year drought.
And I'm wondering if Worrell's Carlton connection was the reason that Reynolds was a Carlton supporter.
Well,
you'd have to assume, wouldn't you?
Well, his father grew up in the area, so his father would have actually been around for those Carlton. He was friends with some of the players from those Carlton teams, so that's why the family barracked for Carlton, because of those teams. So yes, they would have actually worshipped Worrell, I guess, back in the day.
So in only 4 grand finals contested between the two clubs, the ledger sits at 2 apiece, 2 to Collingwood and 2 to Essendon. There's been a lot more finals, of course, between these two clubs, and we're going to talk about 2 or 3 of them now. Dan, let's start talking perhaps about the 1946 semi-final between Essendon and Collingwood that ended up a draw.
Yeah, I think it was the second finals draw ever. The first had been in the 20s. It was Collingwood Essendon, Lou Richards, captain of the Pies, and the great Dick Reynolds, captain of Essendon. And the Bombers had taken all before them in the first year out of the war. We got a lot of players back from the war, so the timing was fantastic, and we just had one of our great teams, really, in 46. Yeah, and in that first final with us and the Magpies, we kicked 14-16, they kicked 13-22, so we both finished on 100. Jack Casson had a chance to win the game for us in the last seconds, but his kick went wide, unfortunately, so we escaped with a draw. Lou Richards was standing next to Dick Reynolds as the siren went, or the bell, might have been a bell back in the 40s, not a siren, and Lou said to Dick, what do we do now, Dick? And Dick said, well, we win the match because we had the last kick. And Lou had to scratch his head for a second before he realised that Dick Reynolds was telling a few fibs. But so they had to come back the next week. It threw the finals out a week. Reynolds had been held fairly quiet in the draw, but he was let off the leash in the second game. And at three-quarter time, the scores was still tied. It was 49 apiece, so it was Groundhog Day at three-quarter time. Gregor, and then we kicked into gear and we kicked away with 4-1 in the last quarter, and we won by 19 points and went on to win the premiership.
That's the main thing.
That's all we care about.
3 years later, back again, this time semi-final, again against Collingwood, of course. Jock McHale, the great Jock McHale, had a fabulous coaching career at Collingwood for, I'm guessing here, 37 years, something like that. Really a legend of the game and a legend of the Collingwood Football Club. That was Jock McHale's last game, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. We knocked them off in that first semi-final, but there's a lot of lead-up into that in terms of history with Jock McHale and Reynolds recognising the significance Jock had on the club. And Dick debuted in 1933, and it took until 1938 before the Bombers actually beat the Pies, coached by Jock McHale. So it took him 5 years to get a win against them. You speak to any of the Essendon players who played under Reynolds and you just mention the word Collingwood and they all laugh and say that Dick was the most placid man you'll ever meet. But as soon as you mention the word Collingwood, he was a different man, and he was he'd always, he was never an overly animated bloke. But before a Collingwood game, the players say there'd be spit coming out of his mouth, and he'd be kicking the ground, and he'd have to have, I think it was Harry Hunter would have to pat him on the back and give him a glass of water, and so he'd get really fired up. Yeah, well, it wouldn't have been any. Yeah, that's right. And then also all through the 30s, kept in Reynolds' mind that they love rubbing it in when they beat us. They love You know, they don't just beat us. They love grinding us into the ground, and it stuck with him. And then one day there's a famous game in 1938. I know we're talking about a final, but we have to go back to...
That's all right, carry on.
Get a bit of context. You go have a glass of water. 1938, round 13. The Pies have won 11 in a row against us. As I said, going back to 1931 was the last time we'd beaten them. And Jack Baggett was coaching the Bombers this day. And he said to the guys, enough's enough. Today's the day we have to stand up and we have to beat them. And he said, what I want you to do is you put an X on their chest, and I want you to just target that X, and you run at that X every chance you get. And it stuck in Reynolds' mind because their mindset changed. They still went in. They were 30 points down at half time this day in 1938. 30 points down. It's a lot. They'd never come back from that far down in their history, which is remarkable. It's only 5 goals, but it says what the times were like. We'd never been able to get back from 5 goals down, and we just went at them in that second half. And with Reynolds starring and his brother Tom Reynolds kicking a couple of goals, I think, they got up and won by a point, and it was a significant day because Collingwood had dominated football for 15 years or so, and Essendon had not. They'd had their worst period, really. And it was a bit of a turning point in the two clubs' histories, and certainly in terms of Jock McHale coaching against Essendon, he didn't win many games after that one against the Bombers, so it was a huge one. So the significance to then go and beat them in that first semi in 1949, Jock McHale had so much history and success, and so for Reynolds and for Essendon it was a really significant day, and they must have quietly shared a little chuckle that it was his last game as coach and they got to get rid of him.
We are the teams they don't fear. They all try their best.
There was another very controversial finals game between these two clubs, Dan, with a bit of biff involved back in '65, between Collingwood and Essendon, preliminary final where Duncan Wright took out John Somerville, and a lot of the people listening to this will have memories of this particular event. What do you recall? What do you know about it?
Yeah, I don't recall a lot of it, but I certainly have spoken with a lot of the guys that were involved at the game. And there's a great photo of Ken Fraser kneeling down to check on a clearly knocked out John Somerville. It's a horrible scene, and I think Barry Capuano was injured that day, and I've spoken with Barry about it, and he was in the stand, and he claims he's the first one that saw it, and we'll take your word, Barry, but he said it was an incident that was such behind play that it took seconds before people were able to click that something was wrong. It was one of those moments, and it was before every game was filmed on TV, so there wasn't any live footage of it or anything like that. So Ken Fraser rushed over. He realised his mate was knocked out.
It was very early in the match, the first about 5 minutes of the match, and the ball was down in front of the members' stand. I can still remember that, and a roar went up at centre half forward. I was concentrating on the ball, but out of the corner of my eye I saw John Somerville lying on the ground. I rushed over to him and bent over him, but he was sort of face down, so I didn't want to pull him up quickly just in case he'd done any serious, but he was sort of out to it, and when I gingerly lifted him up I could see blood running out of his mouth, and he's was just completely concussed.
They had a fair idea who'd done it, but again, not even many players on the field saw it. So Ken thought, being captain, I better run around and just make sure, while they're stretchering him off, I better run around and make sure my teammates are
keep their eyes on the job.
That's right.
But that wasn't Bluey Shelton's idea, was it?
No, he had his vice captain, the tough Bluey Shelton, Ian Bluey Shelton, running around behind him. And after Ken said, "Guys, focus on the ball. Let's move. Let's just head down and we'll win the free kicks." And Bluey was running behind him saying, "Stuff that. Let's whack them. Make sure they don't go near the ball." And Ken didn't know that for years until he bumped into Collingwood's Peter McKenna, and McKenna actually told him that story. So he said they had the perfect leadership style, the two of them.
I asked Bluey about that, a few days later. I said, "Bluey, did you follow me?" "Oh," he said, "I tried to put the wind up them a little bit, So collectively, as captain and vice captain, I think we gave a pretty good message, and ended up winning by about 4 or 5 goals.
The yin and the yang.
And we won, thankfully, and went on to win the flag.
I was talking to Ken about this quite a while ago, and he said that he had seen a similar incident between, or a similar game between Collingwood and Melbourne earlier years before, and Collingwood were roughing up Melbourne, and Melbourne lost the plot and retaliated and lost the game, and it stuck in his mind at that point that if this happens, then you've got to play the ball, not the man, and try to get the result.
In 1958, Collingwood and Melbourne had played in a grand final, and I think Melbourne got really sucked in from the tough tactics that the Collingwood blokes, and Melbourne lost that grand final when they were clearly the better side all year. So that was burning in my mind, and I didn't want our blokes to lose concentration.
And of course, Essendon went on to win the 65 flag.
And the great thing is, Ken remains our oldest living premiership player because of us winning that preliminary final and making it through to the grand final. Oldest living premiership captain, I must say, not player, but our eldest premiership captain, and still fit and healthy, Ken, and fantastic stories he shares if you ever bump into him anywhere.
We'd had 2 good wins in the semi-final and the preliminary final, so we were really playing confidently and well, but St Kilda were the favourites to win. We were a little bit stronger in the air than they were. Ted Fordham had an exceptionally good game and marked very strongly at forward. Our rovers, John Burt and Jack Clark, were very, very good. All of our players were in confident form and in good form, and we were in control pretty well from the third quarter on. We were the better team.
Finally, just one more preliminary final story. Dan, was the game against, well, Collingwood, of course, that's who we're talking about, in 1984. And interesting because, well, it was the drought-breaking premiership for us because we won in 65 and didn't win a flag again until 84. But the margin of that game.
Yeah, I mean, we really all should have a video of this game because it's still, it remains the biggest winning margin in a final, 133 points, 28-6 to 5-11. We just tore them apart that day. We were very hungry to get ourselves that premiership after falling short the year before. So one of our greatest days in a final, and we almost beat it in 2000 when we won by 125 points against North Melbourne in the qualifying final, but that remains our biggest win, and long may it remain our biggest win so we can have that over the Pies at least.
There's been a lot of people who've played for both the clubs too, Dan, as you'd be well aware. I haven't counted them all up. I think I stopped at 40. I'd started listing them, but a few of them come to mind, of course. Des Tuddenham had a great career at Collingwood and then came to Essendon as captain coach, of course, and then went back to Collingwood for a couple more years.
Yeah, after guess got his marching orders from here, but he had 4 years with us, I believe, and he told me one story that when he first came over, he knew that Essendon supporters hated him. There was no way of sugarcoating it. They hated him for what he'd done on the field against the Bombers. So he said he knew he had to make a stand early on to win them over. So the first game just happened to be against the Bulldogs out at Western Oval, I think, and he realised he had to whack someone to get the crowd behind him, so that's what he did. And he said after that the Bombers fans were supportive of him. So we didn't take long to warm to him when he came over.
Doesn't sound like Des to be whacking people.
No.
Let's see, a few. Mel Michael, of course, was here as well. Well, he started at Collingwood, had most of his success, of course, at Brisbane, then came here. Rene Kink, we all remember Rene Kink.
The Incredible Hulk, as they called him, and played in a draw and 4 losing grand finals for Collingwood. And Sheeds told me that he got him over here to just help us get through. We lost a couple of finals. We hadn't. The drought was building, premiership drought, so he needed a couple of big bodies to come in. And I know he got Brian Wood as well over from Richmond, a couple of guys that with senior experience. But Rene was the one to throw his weight around, and he was important, Sheed said, in helping get us through that 83 period and getting us into a grand final. And even though he didn't play in our premierships in 84 and 5. He played an important role, Sheeds reckons, in helping to make us believe, I guess, that we could match it with some of those stronger teams. So he was a handy pickup for that reason alone.
Fabulous Phil Carman.
Is that a good pickup or not?
Well, he wasn't here for very long, and he left in controversial circumstances, but he was an excitement machine, wasn't he?
Certainly. Well, I speak to some guys from the 70s, and they say he's still the best player they saw. He just didn't... He was fit and everything, but he wasn't as committed, I guess, discipline-wise, and we saw that at Essendon, didn't we? He got the head moving at one point. And what was the suspension for that headbutt? Was that against Colin? I was against St Kilda, wasn't it?
Against St Kilda.
Was it 8 weeks or 12 weeks? Oh, it was 20 weeks.
It was longer than that. Yes, I think it was 20.
I reckon it was 20. And so he was only here for 1 or 2 seasons, wasn't he? And
as an aside, Dan, I hate to interrupt you, but we have the jumper from that he wore that day here at the football club, and we'll have it on display very, very soon.
Oh, come in and check that out. That's a real momentous.
But not yet.
Not yet. But don't tell Phil that we've got it.
Just looking through this list here too, Dan, I can see just at the top here 3 or 4 premiership players here. Blake Carosella played for both clubs. Tony Elshaw, of course. Tony Elshaw, part of that 84-85 team, and Ricky Olorenshaw in 93. And a fellow who didn't win a flag, but certainly made his mark on a number of opposition players, if nothing else, and was a good leader. I was a captain of the club too, Ronnie Andrews. Had a long career here at Essendon. I think he played 151 games from memory, and played, I think, 6. Went to Collingwood and finished, I think, with 6. And
he captained us in 1982 when he took over from Neil Danaher, who had injured his knee as well, mate.
Front of the pack, all Essendon. I reckon it's going to be a draw. Grenbold. Time is out. 4 seconds left. The kick by Grenbold. There's the siren. Unbelievable. The season's first draw.
1995, Dan, the first of the modern Anzac Day games, if I can describe it as that, between Essendon and Collingwood. And, gee, what a game. A draw, of course. Huge number of fans, 94,000 we mentioned earlier. Just as many banging on the doors trying to get in. And a lot of excitement, obviously. Obviously a winner right from the start. It looked like it was going to be a real blockbuster from then on in. But a bit of controversy in that game as well.
There was, yeah. We became a huge... There's so many things that come out of that first game. You know, I spoke with Mark Harvey about the significance of that first game, and if he was aware that it was as big as it ended up becoming, like going into the game. And he said, well, we didn't know how big that was going to be. We understood the significance of the day. That was part of Kevin's repertoire. He'd studied a lot of war through armies and generals and things like that, so he'd applied that to some of his footy talk and to sport in general, and so they understood why they were playing on the day, but they didn't quite realise just how significant, probably, that it was going to take off in terms of the popularity.
It doesn't seem that long ago, Dan, 1995, but football today, if I can call it the football industry today, is chalk and cheese compared to what it was in those days. And there was a very dramatic incident involving Michael Long in that game.
Yeah, and it really changed history certainly in terms of sport and racial recognition and reconciliation. Changed the ruling. The AFL were forced to change the rules around that, and I know there's been issues since, but it was really that and Nicky Winmar's stance 2 years earlier in '93, and Michael Long's decision to say enough's enough after Damien said some unsavoury words to him that we won't repeat. But Martin Flanagan, who recently wrote a book on Michael Long, he called it Australia's Nelson Mandela moment. Australian football's Mandela moment, and that's the significance of what it was for Australia in sport and in general. And it's amazing the controversy around that, and it dragged out for a few weeks, and the AFL probably didn't handle it great at first. I think they've admitted that. But really, because of the courage of Michael Long and a few of the Aboriginal players in that mid-90s period, things changed. So we applaud a lot of what happened in that game, the highlights and the close finish with the draw and all the the thrills around that and everything. But what happened in terms of the racial vilification laws, Rule 30 it is, that came out of that, and Michael Long's significance in the Australian community, not just in football, really that game we can thank for that in that if you want to look at it that way.
4 Essendon players have made their debut on Anzac Day, starting with...
No pressure at all for those blokes either, was there?
No, I think if it was me, I'd prefer a quiet game somewhere else. But Scott Lucas in 96, Matthew Banks the following year, Dean Solomon the following year after that, and the most recent was Ben McNeice last year.
Great thrill. I mean, it's what you really played all your junior football to do, is to play a game of AFL football. It was always a dream of mine. And then to debut on Anzac Day, really the biggest home and away game on the calendar, was just enormous.
Certainly, as we saw with Lucas and Solly, they could handle that pressure pretty well, couldn't they? Because they went on to have great careers with us. The others were here a bit shorter time, but geez, that would remain one of the great memories of their life, I would imagine, for Banksy and for McNeice as well. Amazing to make. And I know Collingwood probably had, I think we counted, what was it, eight
Collingwood players made their debut, and that very few, unless you're playing finals, you're not going to be playing in front of 90,000 people very often, and some players go through their careers and not play in front of anything like that. There's been a few milestones on Anzac Days too. Darren Buick played his 200th game in an Anzac Day. Gary Moorcroft, his 50th. Joe Mercedes, his 200th. And Andrew Walsh, his 150th. So there's been a few milestones as well as some debuts as well.
O'Connor just bursts his way through it. Hurd plays on, and surely another one to the Supremo at Essendon, James Hurd.
Well, it's taken on a life of its own, the Anzac Day game, Dan. And in 2000, there was a trophy produced by the league for the winning team, the Anzac Day Trophy, and that's been issued, a perpetual cup that's been issued to the winning team on the day since 2000. And in the same year, the Anzac Day Medal has been issued. And interestingly enough, they went back a couple of years and they started handing those out retrospectively. But the first person to win it in 2000 was...
Great James Hurd, the first of his 3, and he won it again in 03 and 04. I think I was at all 3 of those games, and there's something about Hurdy and Anzac Day that, as we saw as well on Grand Final Day, he just loved those big games, didn't he, Hurdy? And then Andrew Lovett was a surprise winner, I guess, in 2004. He's not one that you think of, but he had a blistering day that day. He was outstanding, running everywhere, running ragged. And then Patrick Ryder in 09, who went down, and Ryder had to step up.
David Hill went down for knee injury, and Ryder had to ruck for the day. And what a day, what a game he made of it, yeah.
And then 2 years later is when they awarded the retrospective ones, so they went back and found Mark McCurry from 1999 and said, well done, you were best on that day as well. So before that it was all Collingwood blokes. So McCurry is officially our first winner, and then after that, 2013, we'll talk about that game in a sec, but David Zaharakis won the medal that day. Oh no, we won't talk about that game in a sec.
We'll talk about another one he played in.
That's part of the myth, though, isn't it? It's very interesting that we, and I'm still referring to it now, that we believe that was the day when he got his Anzac medal, but it wasn't. And then last year, Joey Danaher was sensational and won our, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 times we've won the Anzac medal. So the Pies have got the wood on us there.
Quick handball to Hocking, back to Lovett Murray. He goes short. It's a mark to Zaharakis. Zaharakis has kicked a goal. The Bombers are in front of the G. Unbelievable scenes here. David Zaharakis puts Essendon back in front after all looked lost. Stack the back line. Look at him go down. The Bombers. There's about 18.
You mentioned David Zaharakis winning the medal in 2013, Dan, and also alluded to the fact that many people think that he won it the year that he kicked that remarkable winning goal in 2009. But of course, it was some years later. He had a relatively quiet game in 2009, but we can forgive him for that, because what a way to end a football game, and what a like a boys. You couldn't script something like that. It was like a kid's boys' own adventure, where the young guy who's only a teenager and playing his fourth game in the biggest game of his life, and in the rain and the wet and the mud, with 25 seconds on the clock, puts one through for the narrowest that wins. It's just a heart stopper, wasn't it?
The Bombers have run it. They have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. A magnificent Anzac Day win.
It was, Ben McFarlane, a famous Collingwood supporter. He ranked all the Anzac Day games a couple of years ago, and he ranked that 09 game as the second best after the draw, which must have pained him to write that. But it was one of those days where you go through a game and you think, okay, well, here's the result, and then suddenly magic happens in the last 5 minutes, and it changes your whole thinking of a match, I think, because it just becomes the most amazing finish of all time. You might have mentioned we were 14 points down at the 25-minute mark in the bucketing rain, so you would assume that the game's done and dusted. I'm sure there'd be a few Bomber people who were outside the ground heading for the train, who probably kicking themselves now. But we got a goal. Ricky Dyson kicked a crucial goal, which I've spoken with Zachar about this, and he said that don't forget Ricky's goal, because it was without that, I don't do what I did. Zaharaka says, I remember being on the ground and seeing the ball go through. All the bodies were in front of me. Then I jumped up and Jobe Watson came and hugged me, and from then on it was pretty amazing. He said he got back in the rooms after we won by 5 points. He got back in the rooms and he had 100 text messages on his phone congratulating him. It was just one of the great Essendon moments, wasn't it?
It certainly was.
Essendon by 5 points.
We've covered some ground today, Dan. We've spoken about the very early Anzac Day games, some of the clubs we played against prior to the run with Collingwood. The law change in 1960, where it required a change of the laws to get the Anzac Day game, to get football played on that day. And a little bit around some of the players, some of the great Collingwood games, not just Anzac Day, but some of the great Essendon Collingwood games and finals. And then, of course, finished up with what was probably a highlight of any Essendon supporter at a Collingwood game was David Zaharakis' match winner in 2009. What a heartstopper that was. So thanks for your time, Dan. We'll be back next time and talk more footy. All the best.
And let's hope we're talking about another exciting Collingwood victory this time next year. Victory over Collingwood on Anzac Day. Fingers crossed.
For sure.